Mid-flight, a family was accused of stealing an entire wall, but just 6 minutes later, the flight attendant who made the claim faced unimaginable consequences that no one saw coming. The shocking truth behind the incident turned every passenger against her. Before we dive in, let us know where you're tuning in from, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you love thrilling stories like this. The airplane cabin buzzed with the usual mix of pre-flight energy. A young couple, accompanied by their curious toddler, stepped aboard, their faces alight with anticipation, yet marked by the gentle weariness that comes from traveling as a family. The mother tenderly squeezed her little boy's hand, murmuring soft reassurances to soothe his bubbling excitement, while the father juggled bags and carry-ons with determined care as he navigated the narrow aisle. Their every step was measured and considerate. Polite nods, apologetic smiles exchanged with fellow travelers. Each movement a quiet effort to maintain harmony in the shared space of the plane. Just a few rows ahead, a flight attendant named Lexi surveyed the unfolding scene with an intense, focused gaze. Dressed in a crisply pressed uniform that spoke of precision, her stance exuded confidence and command. Yet beneath that polished exterior there lingered an unmistakable hint of impatience. Colleagues knew to approach her with extra caution during such moments, though unsuspecting passengers remained blissfully unaware of the storm of emotions churning within her. As the family methodically stowed their luggage into the overhead bins, the father carefully set a small backpack at his feet, while the toddler, filled with innocent curiosity, wiggled excitedly and reached for his seatbelt. Around them, other passengers exchanged warm smiles or offered fleeting, indifferent glances before retreating back to their phones or magazines. The scene was as ordinary as any pre-flight routine, a gentle snapshot of life that every traveler could relate to as boarding continued. Lexi then moved steadily down the aisle, her interactions with passengers marked by curt nods and brief, precise instructions. When she passed by the family, her eyes paused a fraction longer than usual, noticing the subtle act of the father tucking his small backpack under the seat in front, a detail hidden from everyone else. Her expression tightened slightly. She moved on without a word, but not without a glance over her shoulder. The final passengers boarded, the announcements began, and as the plane prepared for takeoff, a flurry of activity filled the cabin. Seatbelts clicked into place and last-minute adjustments were made with a palpable urgency. Amid this organized chaos, Lexi's unwavering gaze drifted back to the family, her eyes locking onto them with a focused intensity that cut through the ambient noise. Without hesitation, she retraced her steps along the aisle until she stopped abruptly at their row. Her voice was firm, her tone leaving no room for argument as she addressed the father directly. "Sir," she said, her words carrying just enough volume for nearby passengers to overhear, "did you pick something up that didn't belong to you during boarding?" The couple exchanged confused glances, the mother clutching her son a little closer. "I'm sorry," the father asked, his brows furrowed. "What do you mean?" Lexi's stare didn't waver. "A wallet," she said plainly, "was reported missing in the first few rows. I noticed you handling something earlier. I need to ask if you have it." As her question hung in the air, the murmur of nearby passengers grew louder. Their curiosity piqued as heads turned to catch every detail of the unfolding confrontation. The mother's face flushed with embarrassment, while the father leaned forward, his expression a blend of shock and bewilderment. "I don't have a wallet," he said, his voice steady but confused. "I've only touched my own bag." Lexi crossed her arms, her expression firm. "Then I'll need to take a look," she replied. "This isn't negotiable." A ripple of tension spread through the cabin. A few passengers shifted in their seats as whispers began to ripple among them. The father hesitated, his hand instinctively moving to the backpack tucked under the seat. "You're welcome to look," he said cautiously. "But this feels like a mistake. We didn't take anything." The toddler's soft whimpers grew as the little one sensed the rising tension, prompting the mother to gently rock him in her lap in a tender effort to keep him calm. Yet Lexi's tone remained unyielding. "Mistakes are not," she said. "I need to confirm," as she reached for the bag. With a mix of reluctance and resignation, the father slid the bag forward. His face was etched with both frustration and humiliation as he watched Lexi begin her search. She unzipped the bag with deliberate slowness, every motion laden with tension, as if she expected the wallet to suddenly appear before her eyes. The father sat rigidly, his hands clenched tightly on his lap, while the mother murmured soft reassurances to their now fully crying toddler. The surrounding passengers were whispering louder now, a low buzz of speculation and discomfort filling the cabin. Lexi pulled out a few items: a set of headphones, a snack wrapper, and a paperback book. As she rummaged through the bag, her movements were deliberate yet increasingly agitated, each item emerging like evidence in a trial that she was determined to win. Her fingers worked with precision, gliding over the contents as if searching for a hidden truth, while a flicker of uncertainty betrayed her inner turmoil. When she finally zipped the bag shut and stepped back, her face betrayed a flicker of doubt. "There was no wallet," she stated. The father exhaled sharply, his frustration barely contained. "I told you," he said, his voice steady but edged with anger. "We didn't take anything. This is embarrassing for us and for you." Lexi straightened her jaw, tightening. "I'll have to speak to the other passengers," she said flatly, refusing to acknowledge the implication that she might have been wrong. She turned on her heel and marched to the front of the plane, leaving the family in awkward silence, surrounded by the stares of curious strangers. The mother leaned toward her husband. "Why would she think it was us?" she whispered, her tone strained. "We didn't do anything." The father replied quietly, glancing around the cabin. "I don't know, but she's not letting this go." At the front of the cabin, Lexi paused to confer with another flight attendant who was diligently managing pre-flight checks. The second attendant's frown and subsequent shake of the head silently questioned Lexi's actions, intensifying the atmosphere of uncertainty. Lexi then swept her gaze towards the cockpit with a firm gesture before turning back, her resolve hardening. Standing in the middle of the aisle, she addressed the passengers with clear authority. "If anyone here has seen a wallet that doesn't belong to them, now is the time to return it." Her voice was loud and clipped. "This is your chance to come forward." The cabin fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Passengers exchanged awkward looks, but no one spoke up. A man a few rows back muttered under his breath, loud enough for others to hear, "She's making a scene for nothing." Lexi's sharp gaze darted toward him but quickly returned to the family. Her suspicion remained focused on them, and the tension in the air became almost unbearable. The father leaned back in his seat, his face flushed with humiliation, while the mother looked away, clearly holding back tears. The toddler, oblivious to the gravity of the situation, clutched a stuffed animal tightly. His sniffles broke the silence. Lexi's voice rose slightly, frustration seeping into her tone. "This is serious. I can't allow the plane to take off until this issue is resolved." At that moment, a voice from the back of the plane interrupted her. "I think you need to check your facts before accusing people." It was an older woman, seated a few rows behind the family, her arms crossed and her tone icy. The passengers turned toward her, murmurs growing louder again. Lexi hesitated, clearly caught off guard. "What are you implying?" she asked, narrowing her eyes. Without missing a beat, the woman tilted her head ever so slightly, her expression enigmatic as she extended a graceful gesture toward the vicinity of Lexi's workstation at the front of the plane. "I saw a wallet earlier, near the galley. Maybe you should check there before you start harassing families." Lexi's entire demeanor shifted in an instant. Her body went rigid as the full weight of the woman's insinuations sank in. A brief flash of uncertainty danced across her features, and she slowly turned to scan the indicated area, her eyes betraying a mix of apprehension and resolve. All around her, passengers leaned forward, their collective anticipation turning the cabin into a stage of silent drama. With measured determination, Lexi strode toward the galley. Each step was both purposeful and heavy with unspoken tension, while curious onlookers craned their necks, exchanging hushed whispers that resonated with suspense. Nearby, a family remained rooted in their seats, the father's face simmering with barely contained fury, and the mother, clutching their toddler protectively, watched every move with a piercing, silent scrutiny. Arriving at the bustling galley, Lexi plunged into a frantic search. Her hands worked swiftly as she methodically opened compartments and shifted items, her urgency escalating with every passing moment. Observing from a short distance, the second flight attendant finally approached, their steady voice cutting through the commotion. "What are you doing?" the second attendant asked, their tone firm but calm. Startled by the intrusion, Lexi snapped as she continued her desperate quest, hardly sparing the second attendant a glance. A nearby passenger offered a suggestion. "It might be back here." The attendant's face darkened with disapproval. "Did you check with the passenger who reported it missing? Are you sure it's even lost?" they pressed. For a brief, tense moment, Lexi hesitated, then dismissed the query with a curt, "I'm handling it," as she resumed her rapid search. Before long, her frantic efforts bore fruit. Her fingers brushed against something wedged tightly between two service trays. With a mix of relief and dread, she carefully pulled out a small black wallet. The discovery left her visibly shaken, her face draining of color as she gripped the wallet tightly, almost as if willing the problem away. The second attendant leaned in, eyes narrowing sharply. "Is that it?" they asked, their tone laced with a cutting edge. Lexi paused, turning the wallet slowly over in her hands. As she verified the name on the ID against the missing item report, a palpable tension settled over her features. Her lips pressed into a thin line, silently acknowledging the gravity of the moment. With a frustrated sigh, the second attendant murmured, "You caused all that chaos for nothing? You owe those people an apology." For a fleeting second, Lexi's jaw tensed as if tempted to deflect the blame. But the weight of the passengers' expectant stares and the attendant's disapproval left her no room for evasion. She turned around slowly, wallet in hand, and began the long walk back down the aisle. The murmurs among the passengers grew louder as Lexi approached the family's row. The father sat up straighter, his expression shifting from anger to quiet triumph, while the mother, still holding their toddler, stared at Lexi with a mix of disbelief and cautious expectation as she stopped in front of them. Lexi held out the wallet. Her tone was terse, every word laced with a reluctant formality. "It was found near the galley," she said stiffly. "It seems there was a misunderstanding." The father's brow knitted in disapproval as he released a dry, humorless laugh. "A misunderstanding? You humiliated us in front of the entire plane," he said, his voice rising just enough to draw more attention. "And now it's just a misunderstanding." Lexi parted her lips to counter, yet found herself at a loss for words. Before she could muster a reply, the second flight attendant moved forward, their voice softening into a tone of reconciliation. "We deeply regret the inconvenience this caused you," they said. "This shouldn't have happened, and we'll make sure to address it properly." Finally, the mother broke her silence, her voice gentle yet resolute. "You didn't just inconvenience us," she said, her eyes locking with Lexi's. "You assumed the worst about us without even trying to think it through." The cabin's atmosphere thickened with palpable tension as passengers exchanged knowing nods and murmurs, their collective disapproval of Lexi's actions unmistakable. Shifting awkwardly with a stiffened posture, Lexi could only listen as the father declared, "We'll be speaking to the airline about this." With no further rebuttal, Lexi spun on her heel and retreated toward the galley, her cheeks burning with a deep blush of humiliation. The family sank back into their seats, visibly rattled, yet finding a sliver of relief that the confrontation had finally subsided. Nearby passengers murmured gentle words of consolation and a small giggle escaped from the toddler, who clutched his beloved stuffed animal as if it were a talisman against the earlier turmoil. Yet, the air still simmered with unresolved tension. As Lexi neared the front of the plane, her path was abruptly halted by the captain, who had been silently observing the unfolding drama from the cockpit doorway. Though his face remained an inscrutable mask, his voice resonated with an unmistakable air of authority. "Lexi," he said firmly, "we need to talk now." Reluctantly, Lexi trailed behind the captain toward the galley, her steps now heavy with self-doubt as the collective gaze of the passengers weighed upon her, their murmurs swelling like a relentless tide. Upon reaching the cramped space near the cockpit, the captain pivoted to face her directly, his arms folded and his expression an enigma. "Explain to me what just happened," he said, his voice low but firm. Lexi's confidence wavered as she swallowed hard, her voice catching in her throat. "There was a report of a missing wallet," she began in a defensive tone. "I acted on the information I had." The captain arched an eyebrow in subtle skepticism. Acted on information or acted on assumptions? The weight of his question struck her, and Lexi's cheeks burned in response. "I've been hearing from passengers and the other attendants that you singled out a family without any proof," the captain said. Determined yet shaken, Lexi attempted to straighten her posture, fighting to reclaim the composure that had so quickly evaporated. "I was trying to ensure the wallet was found before we took off. I thought it was reasonable." "You thought it was reasonable to accuse a family with a toddler of theft?" the captain interrupted, his voice sharper now. "In front of everyone? Without verifying any facts?" For a long, breathless moment, Lexi remained silent, her eyes flitting anxiously toward the cabin, where passengers continued to scrutinize her with unyielding gazes. She felt trapped, cornered, not just by the captain's words, but by the growing realization that she had overstepped. "I may have acted too quickly," she admitted, though her tone was far from apologetic. The captain shook his head, clearly unimpressed. "Too quickly, Lexi. You humiliated those people. This isn't just poor judgment. It's a serious lapse in professionalism, and I can't ignore it." Lexi's eyes widened slightly. "Are you saying I'm being disciplined for trying to do my job?" she asked. "I'm saying you're being held accountable for mishandling the situation," the captain replied firmly. "You've put the airline in a bad position, embarrassed passengers, and created unnecessary tension on this flight." Lexi's mouth opened as if to argue, but the captain didn't give her the chance. He glanced over at the second flight attendant, who had been quietly observing from a few steps away, and said, "Take over Lexi's responsibilities for the rest of the flight." Then, turning back to Lexi, he added, "You're done for today. I need you to gather your things." Lexi blinked, the words hitting her like a slap. "Wait," she stammered, her voice lower now. "Are you pulling me from the flight?" The captain didn't hesitate. "Yes. I've spoken with ground control. You'll disembark before we take off, and this will be escalated to management." The second attendant exchanged a quick glance with Lexi, their expression a mix of surprise and quiet approval. Lexi, however, stood frozen, her mind racing as she tried to process what was happening. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder as passengers noticed the interaction at the front of the plane, but the captain's stern tone cut her off. "The flight will continue without you," he said firmly. "Now, gather your belongings and step off the plane." Lexi's face flushed deeper, and for the first time, her confidence completely cracked. She turned silently, her movements stiff as she walked toward her station to retrieve her personal items. The whispers among the passengers grew louder, and Lexi could feel every pair of eyes on her as she made her way down the aisle. The families she had accused sat silently, their expressions unreadable, but their posture upright and resolute. The father's eyes followed Lexi as she passed, and for a brief moment, their gazes met. Lexi quickly looked away, her humiliation now complete. When she reached the exit door, the ground crew was already waiting to escort her off the plane. The captain watched her leave, then turned back to the passengers, picking up the intercom phone. His voice rang out clearly through the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the disruption. We'll be taking off shortly. Thank you for your patience." The cabin erupted in scattered applause as Lexi stepped onto the jet bridge, her head lowered. What she didn't see, however, was the knowing look exchanged between the captain and the second attendant. The situation was far from over, and Lexi was just beginning to understand the gravity of her actions. As the jet bridge door closed behind her, the cabin settled into a tense quiet. The captain returned to the cockpit, leaving the second attendant to smooth things over with the passengers. The family sat in silence, their toddler now asleep in the mother's arms, but their expressions remained tense. Around them, sympathetic glances and murmured reassurances floated through the air. Passengers who had watched the ordeal unfold were still whispering, the story spreading quickly across the cabin. A man seated a row behind the family leaned forward slightly, his voice low, but firm. "You handled that better than most would have," he said to the father. "If it had been me, I'm not sure I could have kept my cool." The father turned slightly, managing a tight smile. "It's not about keeping cool," he replied quietly. "It's about making sure people like her don't get away with this." At that moment, the second flight attendant approached their table, her face carefully neutral but her tone far warmer than Lexi's had ever been. "I just wanted to check in on you," she said, looking directly at the mother. "I know the last hour hasn't been easy." The mother sighed, glancing at her sleeping toddler. "That's putting it lightly," she said, her voice soft but pointed. "We've never experienced anything like this. It's humiliating." The attendant nodded, her expression serious. "I completely understand, and I want you to know that what happened today was unacceptable. The captain has escalated the issue, and I can promise you, it's being addressed." The father tilted his head, his brow furrowing. "How?" he asked, escalating his tone. The attendant hesitated, her professionalism intact but her discomfort clear. "Lexi has been removed from the flight, and the matter is being forwarded to management. I can't say more than that, but I can assure you it won't be ignored." The father sat back, his expression unreadable. After a moment he nodded. "Thank you," he said simply. "But it's not just about us. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." The attendant nodded again, her respect for the family evident. "I couldn't agree more. If there's anything you need during the flight, please let me know." As they walked away, the tension in the cabin began to ease, though it wasn't entirely gone. Passengers settled back into their seats, some still whispering while others flipped through magazines or adjusted their headsets. The family, however, remained quiet. The mother stroked her son's hair absent-mindedly, her thoughts clearly elsewhere, while the father stared out the window, his jaw tight. Meanwhile, on the jet bridge, Lexi stood with her arms crossed, her carry-on bag resting at her feet. She was waiting for the ground crew to escort her back into the terminal, but her mind was spinning. She replayed the last 30 minutes over and over, each detail sharper and more damning than the last. She had made a mistake, a big one, and now it was clear there would be no easy way out of it. As the ground crew approached, Lexi glanced back toward the plane, catching a glimpse of the cabin through the open door. The family was still visible, the mother rocking her child gently, the father sitting tall despite the weight of what had just happened. Lexi felt a pang of something she couldn't quite name. Regret, perhaps, or maybe fear. Whatever it was, it clung to her like a heavy coat as she was led away, back into the plane. The intercom crackled to life again. The captain's steady and calm voice addressed the passengers once more. "Thank you again for your patience. We'll be departing shortly. Please remain seated and prepare for takeoff." The engines began to hum, and the plane started its slow taxi to the runway. The family glanced at each other briefly, their expressions softening just enough to show relief. Yet even as the plane lifted off the ground and climbed into the sky, one thing was certain. This flight was only the beginning of what was to come, for Lexi, for the family, and for the airline. The plane cruised smoothly at altitude, but the tension lingered. The family tried to relax, though it was clear the weight of the earlier confrontation hadn't lifted. The father flipped through the in-flight magazine absent-mindedly, while the mother helped the sleeping toddler close her eyes, her gaze fixed on the seat in front of her. Nearby, passengers kept casting glances in their direction, some offering quiet nods of solidarity, others simply observing the aftermath of what had unfolded at the front of the cabin. The second flight attendant spoke quietly with the captain during a lull in their duties. "What's the next step here?" she asked in a low voice. The captain, still calm but visibly displeased by the situation, responded, "Management is already informed. Lexi will be met by the airline's disciplinary team as soon as we land. But this family deserves more than an apology." "I'll be filing my own report as soon as we're back," the second attendant said, nodding in respectful agreement with the captain. "It's the least we can do after what you all went through back in the cabin." One of the passengers, an older man seated near the family, spoke up in a tone kind but firm. "You handled that well," he said to the father. "Most people would have made a scene, but you stayed calm." The father nodded slowly, his voice quiet. "We didn't want to make it worse for ourselves. But it's not about staying calm, it's about accountability. If we don't speak up, this kind of thing keeps happening." The older man raised an eyebrow. "Are you planning to take it further?" The father met his gaze with steely determination in his eyes. "Absolutely. What she did wasn't just a mistake. It was targeted. We've already drafted an email to the airline, and we'll be following up after the flight." The mother glanced at her husband, her expression softening slightly. "We just want to make sure no one else has to deal with this," she added quietly. The conversation caught the attention of other passengers, who nodded in agreement or murmured quiet words of support. The atmosphere in the cabin slowly began to shift from tension to solidarity, with many clearly siding with the family. Meanwhile, Lexi sat in the terminal holding area, her carry-on bag at her feet and her phone in her hand. She scrolled through emails and messages, her fingers trembling slightly. One message in particular stood out, a notification from the airline's disciplinary department. She hesitated before opening it, her stomach twisting as she read the words. "You are required to report for an internal review regarding your conduct on Flight 331. Further actions will depend on the outcome of this review." Lexi's hands tightened around her phone, her mind racing. This wasn't a simple reprimand. The language was clear, her job was on the line. She thought back to the moment she accused the family, recalling the certainty she'd felt at the time and how quickly it had unraveled. For the first time, she began to truly question herself. Not just her actions, but the assumptions she had made that had led her to this point. Back on the plane, the second flight attendant approached the family again. "I wanted to let you know," she began in a careful but kind tone, "that the captain has escalated this. The airline's management will be contacting you directly once we land." The father gave a small nod, his expression resolute. "Thank you," he said, "but we'll be contacting them too. This isn't over." The attendant nodded, offering a small, understanding smile. "I don't blame you, and if there's anything else you need during the flight, please don't hesitate to ask." As the attendant walked away, the mother turned to her husband. "Do you think they'll take this seriously?" she asked, her voice laced with quiet doubt. "They'll have to," he replied firmly. "We won't let them ignore it." The plane hummed steadily as it continued toward its destination. But for the family, and for the airline, the turbulence ahead was only just beginning. The family remained quiet for the rest of the flight, but the undercurrent of their frustration lingered. The mother absent-mindedly stroked her son's hair while staring out the window, and the father jotted notes on his phone, likely preparing for the conversation they knew they'd have with the airline. Nearby passengers continued to exchange knowing glances, but the awkwardness in the cabin had mostly subsided. The hum of the engines provided a backdrop for an uneasy calm as the flight neared its destination. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be starting our descent shortly. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and trays are secured. On behalf of the crew, we thank you for your patience earlier and look forward to welcoming you safely on the ground." The announcement seemed routine, but the passengers couldn't miss the subtle emphasis on patience. It felt like a quiet acknowledgement of the earlier tension. The family exchanged a brief glance but said nothing. They were clearly waiting to see what would happen once they landed. Meanwhile, in the terminal at their destination, 2 representatives from the airline's management team were already preparing to board the plane as soon as it landed. They had been briefed on the situation by the captain, and it was clear this wasn't going to be handled with a simple apology. They carried officious-looking folders in their hands and spoke in hushed tones, reviewing the captain's preliminary report. The words "public relations nightmare" and "potential lawsuit" were repeated several times as they strategized their approach. Back on the plane, as the cabin descended toward the runway, the father leaned over to his wife. "Once we land," he said quietly, "we're going to make sure this gets escalated properly. No brushing it under the rug." The mother nodded but hesitated. "Do you think they'll really listen to us? Or will they just try to smooth things over and hope we forget?" The father's jaw tightened. "If they think we'll let this go, they're wrong." The plane landed with a gentle thud and the usual shuffle of passengers unbuckling seatbelts, and gathering bags began. The family stayed seated, waiting for the aisles to clear. A few passengers stopped briefly as they passed, offering quiet words of support. "That was unfair. What happened to you?" one woman said softly. "I hope you make them pay attention." The father nodded, his expression still determined. "We will." As the last passengers exited the plane, the second flight attendant approached the family one final time. "I just wanted to thank you for your patience," she said, her voice carrying a genuine tone of regret. "I've already noted what happened in our internal report, but if there's anything specific you want included, please don't hesitate to share it with the management team waiting for you at the gate." The mother looked up, surprised. "They're waiting for us?" The attendant nodded. "Yes, they've been briefed by the captain. I think they understand how serious this is." The father stood, gathering their bags. "Good," he said firmly. "Then they'll hear exactly what we have to say." The family stepped off the plane and onto the jet bridge, where 2 airline representatives were waiting. Their expressions were professional but cautious, clearly aware of the gravity of the situation. One of them stepped forward, extending a hand to the father. "Thank you for waiting," she said, her voice calm but carefully measured. "We're here to discuss what happened and ensure that this is addressed appropriately." The father shook her hand, but didn't smile. "We're not interested in empty apologies," he said bluntly. "What happened on that plane was unacceptable, and we're not letting it slide." The mother stood close behind him, holding their toddler, whose head rested on her shoulder. Her expression was quiet but no less firm. The representatives exchanged a glance before motioning for the family to follow them toward a private meeting room near the gate. As they walked, the father turned slightly to his wife and whispered, "They'll listen. They don't have a choice." The airline staff watched nervously as the family disappeared down the corridor, the weight of their mistake growing heavier with each passing moment. Whatever happened next, it was clear this was far from over. The small meeting room near the gate felt sterile and cold, with its plain walls and a simple table surrounded by stiff chairs. The airline representatives ushered the family inside, offering polite but strange smiles. The father took a seat directly across from them, his posture upright and unyielding. The mother sat beside him, balancing their still tired toddler on her lap, her expression calmer but no less resolute. One of the representatives, a woman with a poised demeanor and a company badge clipped neatly to her blazer, began the conversation. "First, let me express our sincerest apologies for what happened on your flight," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "This kind of incident is not representative of the standards we strive to maintain." The father leaned forward slightly, his gaze sharp. "An apology doesn't undo the humiliation we just went through," he said, his tone steady but pointed. "Your flight attendant publicly accused us of theft in front of an entire plane. She made my wife cry, terrified my son, and made assumptions about us with no evidence. What part of that is even close to your standards?" The woman's calm exterior faltered for a moment. She glanced at her colleague, a younger man who quickly picked up the conversation. "We completely understand your frustration," he said. "The captain has already filed a report, and the flight attendant involved has been removed from duty pending a formal review." The mother, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. Her voice was quieter, but carried the weight of her emotions. "That's not enough," she said, looking directly at the representatives. "You can't just suspend her and call it a day. What she did wasn't a mistake. It was bias, plain and simple. She looked at us and decided we were guilty. What's to stop this from happening to another family?" The room fell silent for a moment, the tension thick as the representatives absorbed her words. The woman in the blazer nodded slowly. "You're absolutely right," she admitted. "This isn't something we can address with just one person. We need to examine our policies and training to ensure this doesn't happen again." The father's expression didn't soften. "And what does that mean? A memo? A quick training session so you can check a box and move on?" The woman shook her head, her tone becoming firmer. "No, we're committing to a full review of our procedures, including mandatory bias training for all staff, and changes to how situations like this are handled on board. These measures are already in motion, and will provide you with regular updates on their progress." The mother exchanged a glance with her husband, her expression skeptical, but slightly less tense. "And what about us?" she asked. "What are you doing to make this right for our family?" The younger representative cleared his throat nervously. "Of course we want to offer compensation for your experience," he said quickly, sliding a folder across the table. "This includes a full refund for your tickets, complimentary first-class upgrades on your next trip, and a travel credit for future flights." The father eyed the folder but didn't touch it. "That's nice," he said dryly, "but this isn't just about free flights. We want to know that real changes will happen, and that people like her won't have the power to humiliate families like ours again." The representatives nodded, their discomfort clear as the father's words hung in the air. The mother shifted in her seat, adjusting their toddler, who had dozed off again, his small hands clutching her shoulder. "If we accept this," she said softly, "it's because we're trusting that you'll follow through. But if we see no changes, this won't end here." The woman in the blazer leaned forward, her tone more earnest now. "I can assure you we're taking this very seriously. What happened today is not something we sweep under the rug." The father finally picked up the folder, flipping through its contents before closing it firmly. "We hold you to that," he said. Standing, his wife followed, balancing their child in her arms, her expression still guarded as they exited the room. The representatives exchanged uneasy glances. They had done their best to contain the situation, but the family's resolve left no doubt this wasn't just about repairing a single incident. It was about accountability and whether the airline was truly ready to embrace it. The family walked out of the meeting room and into the bustling terminal, their pace steady but their expressions still heavy with frustration. The father held the folder tightly in one hand, his other arm protectively around his wife's shoulder as she balanced their sleeping toddler. The chaos of the airport felt distant compared to the whirlwind of emotions they had just endured. "We're not done," the father said quietly, his voice carrying a firmness that made the mother glance up at him. Compensation is one thing, but if they think that's enough to keep us quiet, they're wrong. The mother nodded but said nothing. Her eyes scanned the terminal absent-mindedly, though her mind was clearly elsewhere. She was replaying the incident over and over. The accusing tone in Lexi's voice, the stares of the passengers, the way her son's cries had filled the air as they were singled out. It wasn't just humiliating, it was hurtful, and no amount of apologies or refunds could erase how it had made her feel. As they moved toward the baggage claim, the father's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and read the email notification that had just arrived. "It's from the airline," he muttered, tilting the screen so his wife could see. The subject line read, "Formal follow-up regarding incident on Flight 331. He opened it, skimming the contents quickly. "They've escalated this to corporate," he said, in a tone that was neutral but tense. "They're setting up a formal investigation. They want a detailed account of what happened." The mother raised an eyebrow. "Do you think they're serious? Or is this just damage control?" The father frowned. "It's hard to say, but we're going to give them exactly what they're asking for. Every detail, every mistake she made, every way they failed us. If they want an account, we'll give them one they can't ignore." By the time they reached the baggage carousel, the toddler stirred in his mother's arms, letting out a small yawn. She adjusted him carefully, pressing a kiss to his forehead as he blinked sleepily. "Are we going home now?" he asked softly, his voice groggy. "Yes, sweetie," she murmured. "We're going home." As they waited for their luggage, a few passengers from their flight passed by, some offering quiet nods of support, others avoiding eye contact altogether. One woman stopped briefly, her expression a mix of sympathy and encouragement. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry for what you went through," she said softly. "It wasn't right." The mother offered a polite smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thank you," she said, her tone kind but weary. The woman hesitated, as if she wanted to say more, but after a moment she simply nodded and walked away. The father let out a long breath, rubbing the back of his neck. "We're going to need to stay on this," he said almost to himself. "They'll try to move on, but we can't let them." "I know," the mother replied, "but what if they don't care? What if this is just about avoiding bad press?" The father shook his head. "If that's all they care about, then we'll make sure the press hears about it. They won't have a choice." Meanwhile, in a separate part of the terminal, Lexi sat in a small office, her back stiff and her hands folded tightly in her lap. Across the desk sat a member of the airline's disciplinary team, a middle-aged man with a tired but serious expression. Between them was a copy of the report the captain had submitted, detailing every step of the incident. "This isn't good," the man said, flipping through the pages, as Lexi sat in silence. "You created a scene, accused passengers of theft without evidence, and disrupted the flight. Do you understand how serious this is?" Lexi's lips pressed into a thin line. She wanted to defend herself, to insist that she had acted in good faith, but the words wouldn't come. Deep down, she knew there was no defense. She had made assumptions about the family, about the situation, about her authority, and those assumptions had led to a disaster. "I was just trying to resolve the situation quickly," she said finally, though even to her own ears it sounded weak. The man sighed, closing the folder and leaning forward. "That's not how it comes across. It looks like you targeted a family with no real justification, and now the airline is dealing with the fallout." Lexi swallowed hard, her throat dry. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're being placed on administrative leave while the investigation is conducted," the man replied. "We'll be reviewing passenger statements, staff accounts, and the captain's report. If it's determined that your actions violated company policy, and from what I've read it's very likely, you'll face termination." Lexi's chest tightened, and for a moment she couldn't speak. She had always prided herself on being efficient, decisive, and professional. But now those same qualities felt like the very things that had brought her to this point. The man stood, gathering his papers. "You'll receive official notification soon. In the meantime, I suggest you reflect on what happened. This isn't just about you. It's about how you represent this airline, and today, you didn't represent it well." As he left the room, Lexi sat frozen, her mind racing. She thought back to the family, the father's quiet but firm defiance, the mother's devastated expression, the child's tears. She had convinced herself she was doing her job, but now she was beginning to see the cracks in that justification. For the first time, the weight of her actions truly began to settle over her. At baggage claim, the family collected their suitcases and headed for the exit. The father's phone buzzed again. This time, a news notification. He paused, reading it quickly, before showing it to his wife. The headline read, "Airline under fire after family publicly accused of theft mid-flight." The mother's eyes widened. "It's already out there," she said. The father nodded. "Looks like someone on the plane recorded it. This might get bigger than they expected." The mother glanced down at their son, who was now fully awake and clinging to her hand. "Good," she said softly. "They need to see what it's like when people don't just let things go." As they stepped into the cool evening air outside the terminal, the father placed a hand on his wife's shoulder. "We make sure they hear us," he said. "All of them." The mother nodded, her expression softening but her determination unwavering. "They'll hear us," she repeated, "one way or another." As the family drove away from the airport, the tension in the car was heavy, though it was balanced by a quiet determination. The father kept one hand on the wheel, his knuckles white from gripping too tightly, while the other rested on his lap, still holding his phone. Notifications continued to pour in. Texts from family members who had already seen the viral video, emails from the airline promising follow-up, and even a few messages from reporters asking for interview. The mother sat in the passenger seat, scrolling through her own phone, her expression a mix of exhaustion and focus. "It's everywhere," she said softly, breaking the silence. "The video's been shared hundreds of times already. People are commenting, and they're furious." The father glanced at her briefly, his jaw tightening. "Good. Let them be angry. Maybe it'll force the airline to take real action." In the back seat, their son sat quietly, hugging his stuffed animal as he looked out the window. He seemed calmer now, though his earlier distress still lingered in the form of occasional sniffles. The mother glanced back at him and reached over to gently stroke his hair. "You okay, sweetheart?" she asked softly. He nodded, but didn't say anything. The mother sighed and turned back to her phone, opening one of the messages from a journalist. "They want to know if we're willing to make a statement," she said, glancing at her husband. "Do you think we should?" The father was quiet for a moment, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Not yet," he said finally. "Let the video speak for itself for now. If the airline doesn't step up, then we'll talk. But we'll do it on our terms." The mother nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. She continued scrolling, pausing occasionally to read some of the comments on the video. Most were supportive, expressing outrage at how the family had been treated. But a few were less sympathetic, questioning whether the situation had really been as bad as the video made it seem. "Some people think we're exaggerating," she said quietly, almost to herself. "They're saying Lexi was just doing her job." The father exhaled sharply, his frustration evident. "Of course they are. There are always people like that. But anyone who was on that plane knows the truth. You saw how the other passengers reacted." The mother nodded again, though the comments clearly lingered in her mind. She put her phone down and turned to look out the window, watching as the city lights blurred past. "I just don't want this to turn into something bigger than it needs to be," she said softly. "I want them to fix it, but I don't want our family dragged through the mud." The father reached over and placed a reassuring hand on her knee. "We'll handle it," he said firmly. "We're not going to let them twist this around. They need to take responsibility, and if they don't, we'll make sure they do." At the same time, in a different part of the city, Lexi sat alone in her small apartment. The usually tidy space was cluttered now, with her uniform tossed over the back of a chair and her suitcase still sitting unpacked by the door. She was hunched over her laptop, scrolling through the same viral video that the family had seen. Her face was pale, and her hands trembled slightly as she read the comments beneath it. Unbelievable. How does someone like her even get hired? She should be fired immediately, one person had written. Another said, "This is why people don't trust airlines anymore." The harsh words felt like physical blows, each one chipping away at the confidence she had once carried so easily. Lexi had always thought of herself as a professional, someone who knew how to handle difficult situations and make quick decisions. But now she was beginning to see how those decisions had spiraled into something she couldn't control. Her phone buzzed on the table beside her, and she hesitated before picking it up. It was an email from the airline, marked urgent. She opened it slowly, dreading what it might say. The message was short and formal. "You are required to attend a disciplinary hearing on Tuesday at 9 a.m. Failure to appear will result in immediate termination." Lexi let the phone drop back onto the table, her stomach twisting. She had known this was coming, but seeing it in writing made it feel real in a way it hadn't before. She thought back to the family, the way the mother had clutched her crying child, the way the father had looked at her with a mixture of anger and disbelief. Lexi had convinced herself she was in the right at the time, but now she wasn't so sure. She glanced back at the comments on the video, her eyes catching one in particular. This isn't just about one flight attendant. It's about a whole system that lets people like her get away with this kind of thing. Airlines need to do better. The words struck a chord in her, though she wasn't sure why. Lexi had always thought of herself as part of the solution, a professional doing her best in a tough job. But now, she couldn't ignore the possibility that she had become part of the problem. Back at home, the family had finally settled in, though the day's events still hung over them like a loud echo. After putting their son to bed, the parents sat together in the living room, the father's laptop open on the coffee table. He was drafting a detailed account of the incident for the airline's investigation, listing every moment in excruciating detail. "She accused us the second she saw us," he wrote, his fingers moving quickly over the keys. The mother read over his shoulder, occasionally adding her own thoughts. "Make sure you include the part where the other passengers stood up for us. They need to know it wasn't just us who thought it was wrong." The father nodded, adding, "This isn't going to go away." He said quietly, "And if they think it will, they're in for a surprise." As they worked together, their determination grew stronger. The day had been exhausting and painful, but they weren't going to let it end there. For their son, for themselves, and for anyone else who might find themselves in their position, they were ready to fight. This wasn't just about their family, it was about holding an entire system accountable. The next morning, the video of the incident had gained even more traction, spreading across social media platforms and news outlets alike. Headlines began to emerge, each angling the story differently. "Family humiliated by flight attendant's false accusation." Or, "Airline faces backlash over mid-flight scandal." The comments poured in, with thousands of people sharing their own travel horror stories, expressing outrage at the airline and demanding accountability. It was clear this incident had struck a nerve far beyond the confines of the flight. At the family's home, the father was up early, sitting at the dining table with a cup of coffee in one hand and his laptop open in front of him. He had spent much of the night finishing the detailed account for the airline's investigation, and now he was sifting through the flood of emails and messages they'd received. Reporters were offering interviews, Legal experts were providing unsolicited advice, and ordinary people were reaching out to offer their support. The mother entered the room, still in her robe, holding their son's hand as he rubbed his eyes sleepily. "You're already up?" she asked, her voice soft but tired. "I couldn't sleep," the father admitted, gesturing to the laptop. "There's too much happening. Everyone's talking about it. Have you seen the news?" The mother nodded as she settled their son into his chair at the table. "It's everywhere," she said. "I woke up to 5 messages from friends asking if it was us in the video." She poured a glass of juice for their son, her movements deliberate but slow. "What are we going to do if this gets even bigger?" The father leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowed in thought. "We're going to keep pushing. They're the ones who let this happen, and they're the ones who need to fix it. If the video puts pressure on them, then so be it." The mother hesitated, looking at their son, who was now munching on a piece of toast. "I just don't want this to affect him," she said quietly. "He's too young to understand what's happening, but if this keeps growing, I don't know." The father reached across the table, resting his hand on hers. "We'll protect him," he said firmly. "But we're doing this for him too. What if this had happened when he was old enough to remember it? What kind of example would we be setting if we let it slide?" The mother nodded slowly, though the worry in her eyes didn't entirely fade. "You're right," she said. "But we need to stay in control of the narrative. If we do talk to the media, it has to be on our terms." The father agreed, and they spent the next hour discussing their options, carefully drafting a response to the most persistent journalists. They decided to issue a brief statement, acknowledging the incident but focusing on the broader issue of fairness and professionalism in customer service. They would decline any interviews for now, keeping the focus on the airline's actions or lack thereof. By mid-morning, the airline finally broke its silence, releasing a public statement on its social media channels. It read, "We are aware of the incident involving one of our crew members and a family on Flight 331. We take these matters seriously and are conducting a full investigation. The crew member in question has been placed on leave pending the outcome. We are committed to ensuring that all passengers are treated with respect and dignity." The statement was met with mixed reactions. Some applauded the airline for addressing the issue, while others criticized it as vague and insufficient. The family, reading the statement together, fell firmly in the latter camp. "They're just trying to save face," the father said, his voice laced with frustration. "This doesn't even come close to addressing what happened." The mother frowned, rereading the statement. They didn't even acknowledge what she did. No mention of the false accusation, the humiliation, or the fact that she refused to apologize. It's like they're trying to sweep it under the rug. The father's jaw tightened. "We're not going to let them." Meanwhile, Lexi was sitting in a sterile meeting room at the airline's headquarters, waiting for her disciplinary hearing to begin. She had barely slept the night before, and her usually polished appearance was noticeably frayed. Her hair slightly unkempt, her makeup minimal. She clutched a folder in her lap, though she wasn't sure why. There was no defense she could mount that would erase what had happened. The door opened and 3 members of the disciplinary committee entered. They took their seats across from her, their expressions neutral but firm. The man in the center, who appeared to be the chair of the committee, spoke first. "Thank you for coming, Miss Parker," he began, his tone professional but cool. "As you know, we are here to review your actions on Flight 331 and determine the appropriate course of action." Lexi nodded stiffly, her throat dry. "I understand," she said, though her voice wavered slightly. The chair opened a folder in front of him, glancing briefly at its contents before continuing. "We've reviewed the captain's report, passenger statements, and the video footage that has now gone viral. Based on this evidence, it's clear that your actions were inappropriate and unprofessional. Would you like to provide your account of what happened?" Lexi hesitated, her hands gripping the edge of the table. She knew the truth wouldn't absolve her, but she had to say something. I was trying to resolve the situation quickly, she began, her voice faltering. The wallet was missing and I thought— What? The chair interrupted, his gaze sharp. That it was acceptable to accuse a family without evidence, to create a public spectacle that humiliated them and disrupted the flight. Lexi's face flushed. I made a mistake, she admitted quietly. I shouldn't have acted the way I did. The chair leaned back slightly, his expression unimpressed. A mistake is forgetting to double-check a ticket. What you did was more than a mistake. It was a gross lapse in judgment, and it has damaged this airline's reputation. Lexi sat in silence, her head bowed. She had no defense, no argument. All she could do was wait for the inevitable. The chair exchanged a glance with the other committee members before speaking again. We will review this matter further and notify you of our decision within 48 hours. In the meantime, you are suspended without pay. You are dismissed. Lexi stood slowly, clutching her folder as she left the room. The weight of the committee's words hung heavily over her, but it was nothing compared to the weight of her own regret. For the first time, she truly began to understand the consequences of her actions, not just for herself, but for the family she had wronged. Back at the family's home, the morning had turned into a whirlwind of activity. The father was now on a phone call with the airline's customer relations department, speaking firmly but without raising his voice. The mother sat nearby, keeping an ear on the conversation, while trying to distract their son with a coloring book. The tension in the air was unmistakable, and though they tried to act as though things were normal, both parents knew their lives had been thrust into the public spotlight. I appreciate your apology, the father said into the phone, his tone measured. But an apology isn't enough. My family was publicly humiliated, and your crew member didn't just make a mistake. She acted on prejudice. This isn't just about what happened to us. It's about the way you allow your employees to behave. We need concrete assurances that this will be addressed. The voice on the other end of the line responded, and the father listened intently, his lips pressed into a thin line. After a moment, he interjected, Yes, we've seen the public statement. It's vague and doesn't address the heart of the issue. What steps are you taking to ensure this doesn't happen again? The mother glanced at him with an expectant expression. He held up a hand, signaling for her to wait. The person on the phone began to outline the airline's next steps, including internal investigations, disciplinary action against the flight attendant, and planned sensitivity training for staff. When the call ended, the father exhaled deeply, setting the phone down on the table. They're trying to cover their bases, he said, his frustration evident. They say they're doing an internal review and planning new training programs, but it all feels like damage control. The mother frowned. Did they say anything about Lexi? What's happening with her? They said she's suspended while they investigate, the father replied, leaning back in his chair. They wouldn't confirm anything beyond that. The mother shook her head, her fingers nervously tapping the table. So she gets to sit at home while we're left picking up the pieces? That's not enough. The father nodded. I know, but if they think that's all it'll take to make this go away, they're in for a rude awakening. Just then his phone buzzed again, a text message from an unknown number. He hesitated before opening it. The message was short and to the point. This is Lexi Parker. I need to speak with you. His eyebrows shot up in surprise, and he immediately showed the message to his wife. She reached out and asked, her tone filled with disbelief, Why would she do that? I don't know, the father admitted, staring at the screen. But I'm not sure we should even respond. What could she possibly have to say to us now? The mother folded her arms, her expression conflicted. Maybe she wants to apologize. Maybe she's trying to save herself. Either way, it doesn't change what she did. The father set the phone down, his mind racing. I'll think about it, he said finally, but whatever she has to say, it won't undo what happened. Meanwhile, Lexi sat in her apartment, staring at her phone. The message she'd sent to the father felt like a lifeline. One last attempt to take control of a situation that had spiraled far beyond her reach. She hadn't expected him to reply right away, but the silence that followed her text was deafening. Her suspension had left her with little to do but reflect on the incident, and the more she thought about it, the more her initial justifications unraveled. She had made assumptions about the family, assumptions that had no basis other than her own biases. And when those assumptions were proven wrong, she had doubled down, refusing to admit her mistake. Now, the consequences were crashing down around her. Lexi's mind replayed the moments on the plane over and over. The way the mother's eyes had filled with tears. The way the father had looked at her with quiet fury. The way the toddler had clung to his mother, crying in confusion. She had never meant to hurt them, but her intentions didn't matter. What mattered was what she had done. Her thoughts were interrupted by a notification on her phone. She glanced at the screen and saw that the father had replied, "What do you want?" Lexi hesitated, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. How could she explain what she wanted when she wasn't entirely sure herself? She typed a response, slowly, carefully choosing her words. "I want to apologize, not as an employee of the airline, but as a person. I know I can't undo what happened, but I'd like the chance to say I'm sorry directly to you and your family." She hit send and immediately felt a pang of regret. Would they even believe her? Did she deserve to be heard after what she'd done? The doubt gnawed at her as she waited for a response. Back at the family's home, the father read Lexi's message aloud. The mother's expression hardened as she listened, but her silence spoke volumes. Finally, she said, "Do you think she means it, or is she just trying to save her job?" "I don't know," the father admitted, "but part of me feels like we should hear her out. If she's genuine, maybe it's a step in the right direction." The mother frowned, clearly torn. What she did was horrible, but if she's actually willing to take responsibility, maybe it's worth listening. Maybe it'll help us move forward. After a long pause, the father replied to Lexi's message. "We'll hear what you have to say, but this doesn't mean we forgive you." Lexi read the message almost immediately, her heart pounding. She typed back quickly, "Thank you, just tell me when and where." As the father set his phone down, the mother let out a long sigh. "I hope this isn't a mistake," she said softly. The father nodded. "So do I," he replied. "But whatever happens, it doesn't change the fact that this is bigger than her. The airline still has a lot to answer for." The two sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the decision settling over them. Outside, the world continued to buzz with the fallout from the incident, but for the family, the next step felt as uncertain as ever. 2 days later, the family sat in the corner of a quiet cafe waiting for Lexi to arrive. The air was heavy with tension, and though the father appeared composed, his fingers tapped nervously against the table. The mother sat beside him, her hands folded tightly in her lap while their toddler quietly colored on a piece of paper in front of him, oblivious to the charged atmosphere. The father glanced at his watch, exhaling slowly. "She said she'd be here at 2, he muttered. "She'd come," the mother said softly, though her own unease was evident in the way her eyes darted toward the door every few seconds. "If she doesn't, it tells us all we need to know." Minutes later, Lexi entered the cafe, scanning the room until she spotted the family. She hesitated briefly, then squared her shoulders and walked toward their table. Gone was the polished, commanding presence she had on the plane. She now looked smaller, humbled, and far less confident. Her eyes were tired, and her movements deliberate but hesitant. "Thank you for meeting me," Lexi said, her voice low as she approached the table. The father gestured to the seat across from them, but his expression remained firm. "Say what you came to say," he said plainly, his tone giving nothing away. Lexi sat down, setting a small notebook on the table in front of her, though she didn't open it. She clasped her hands together and took a deep breath before speaking. "I'm not here as a representative of the airline," she began, her voice steady but quiet. "I'm here because I need to take responsibility for what I did." The mother watched her closely, her gaze unflinching. "You humiliated us," she said, her voice calm but sharp. "You made assumptions about us without knowing anything, and when you were wrong, you didn't even have the decency to apologize." Lexi nodded, her face flushing. "You're absolutely right," she said. "I was wrong. I made assumptions. I had no right to make them, and I let those assumptions dictate how I treated you. It was unprofessional, it was unfair, and it was deeply wrong." The father crossed his arms, his eyes narrowing slightly. "And why now?" he asked. "Why come to us after the damage is already done? Are you trying to save your job?" Lexi shook her head quickly. "No," she said firmly. "This isn't about my job, to be honest. I don't think I'll keep it after this, and maybe I don't deserve to. But this isn't about that. It's about you. About what I put you through. I can't undo it, but I needed to tell you face to face that I'm sorry. Not because someone told me to apologize, but because I truly am." For a moment, no one spoke. The cafe's background noise, the clinking of cups, the soft hum of conversation, filled the silence between them. The mother studied Lexi carefully, searching for any sign of insincerity. "You didn't just hurt us," the mother said finally. "You made us feel small, like we didn't belong. Do you understand what that feels like?" Lexi's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and she nodded slowly. "I do now," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "And I hate that I made you feel that way. There's no excuse for it." The father exchanged a glance with the mother, his expression softening slightly. "We are not the ones you should be saying this to," he said. "You need to take this to the airline, to your colleagues, to anyone else who might make the same mistake you did." "I will," Lexi said quickly. "I've already started writing a letter to the airline's board. They need to know how this happened and how it can be prevented in the future. I don't expect them to listen to me, but I have to try." The mother's posture relaxed slightly, though her face remained serious. "You're right, you do need to try, because this isn't just about you or us. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Lexi nodded, wiping a tear from the corner of her eye. "Thank you for giving me the chance to say this," she said. "I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to hear it from me." The father leaned forward, his tone measured. "It's not about forgiveness, it's about accountability. And that's bigger than just an apology." Lexi nodded again, understanding the weight of his words. She stood, hesitating for a moment before saying, "I hope in time you can heal from what I did. And I hope I can do better." Without waiting for a reply, she left the cafe, her shoulders hunched but her steps purposeful. The family watched her go, their expressions a mix of emotions: anger, sadness, and perhaps a sliver of understanding. The father turned to his wife. "Do you think she meant it?" he asked. The mother stared at the door where Lexi had exited, her brow furrowed in thought. "I think she did," she said quietly. "But words are just words. Let's see what she actually does." The father nodded in agreement, then looked down at their son, who had been quietly coloring throughout the meeting. The boy looked up, his innocent eyes free of the day's burdens. "Can we go home now?" he asked softly. The mother smiled faintly and nodded. "Yes, sweetie, let's go home." As they gathered their things and left the cafe, the weight of the incident still lingered, but so did the hope that something meaningful might come of it. The family knew the fight wasn't over. The airline had more to answer for, and change wouldn't happen overnight. But for the first time since the flight, they felt a small sense of closure. It wasn't an ending, but it was a start. From Lexi's story, a flight attendant, We learn the importance of being careful and verifying information before taking action. Lexi wrongly accused a family based on her own biases, causing them embarrassment and emotional pain, while also tarnishing the airline's reputation. Her hasty actions created a tense atmosphere on the flight, with passengers and colleagues witnessing a serious mistake. The key lesson here is that before passing judgment, we need to listen and thoroughly understand the situation, rather than letting our emotions drive our decisions. When mistakes happen, admitting them and taking prompt steps to correct them is essential for rebuilding trust. Each of us should learn from our experiences and strive to act fairly, respectfully, and professionally, which in turn helps build a more compassionate work environment. Ultimately, this story reminds us of the value of caution. It shows that double-checking our assumptions and being open to feedback can prevent unnecessary harm, both to others and to ourselves. In short, a little care and proper verification can go a long way in keeping our actions responsible and our reputations intact. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. See you in the next one.